at 700 on January 24, 1945, inside a frozen command post north of the Colmar Pocket in eastern France. German artillery ripped through a tree line 400 yards ahead, shaking timbers and sifting ice-cold dust onto unfolded maps. The air smelled of cordite and frozen earth coffee sloshed in tin cups, and every impact snapped closer as shells walked methodically toward the thin American line outside. First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor, 25 years old, barely 5'6", and still healing from recent wounds, stood over the table as 3rd Battalion's intelligence officer, a role meant for reports and pencils, not exposed ground. Beyond the trees, roughly 600 German infantry and 6 Tiger tanks from the 19th Army were assembling for a counterattack, aimed at breaking this exhausted sector open before daylight fully settled. 3rd Battalion had held here for 18 days in temperatures averaging 10 degrees below zero, losing 43 men to shelling and snipers, knowing that if armor reached the foxholes, the line would collapse in minutes. There were no American tanks in position, no tank destroyers covering the approaches, and the only weapon capable of stopping Tigers was artillery firing from 3 miles back. That artillery was now blind. The forward observation post had just been destroyed, its observers killed or wounded, leaving no one who could see the German advance through the frozen woods. Someone would have to cross 400 yards of open snow under artillery fire and lie ahead of the line while Tigers and infantry closed in. Who steps forward when survival is optional? By January 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered its final brutal phase, but it was far from settled. Along the eastern edge of France, one German-held pocket still refused to collapse. The Colmar Pocket stretched across roughly 850 square miles of frozen forest villages and farmland west of the Rhine River, anchored between the Vosges Mountains and the flat approaches into Germany itself. It was the last piece of France still held by German ground forces. For Berlin, that pocket mattered. As long as it held, it threatened Allied supply routes, tied down divisions badly needed elsewhere, and offered a narrow chance to disrupt the Allied push toward the Rhine. For the Allies, it was a bleeding wound. The French First Army had spent weeks trying to crush the pocket, attacking through snow mud and ice, losing thousands of men without forcing a decisive breakthrough. Every failed assault hardened German defenses and drained Allied momentum. On January 1, 1945, the situation worsened. Hitler launched Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive in the West, ordering Army Group G to punch through American lines in Alsace and exploit any weakness before Allied numbers became overwhelming. While the Battle of the Bulge still raged hundreds of miles to the north, Nordwind struck thinly held American sectors in freezing conditions, aiming to tear open the southern flank of the Allied front. North of the Colmar Pocket, 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment held a narrow stretch of ground that mattered more than its map size suggested. Roads, supply tracks, and lateral movement corridors all passed behind it. If this line failed, German armor could roll into the rear areas of 6th Army Group. For 18 straight days, the battalion had lived in shallow foxholes scraped into frozen ground. Temperatures hovered around 10 degrees below zero. There was no moonlight at night, only darkness broken by artillery flashes and flares. Men slept in short bursts when the shelling paused. Boots, frozen stiff by morning hands, cracked and bleeding from cold metal and wire. German patrols probed the line almost every night, testing reactions, mapping positions, waiting. In just 2 weeks, 3rd Battalion had lost 43 men, most to artillery and snipers rather than direct assaults. Each loss thinned a line that had no depth to spare. If the Germans broke through here, there would be no immediate second line to fall back on. There would be no time to reorganize. One successful counterattack could reopen the Colmar Pocket and change the shape of the front overnight. Garland Merle Connor did not look like the kind of officer men expected to see when a line was about to break. At 5'6" and about 120 pounds, with a quiet voice and a farmer's posture, he blended easily into the background of a battalion command post. He had grown up on a tobacco farm in rural Kentucky, miles from the nearest high school, and he never finished his formal education. When he enlisted in March 1941, the Army saw a small farm boy who had rarely traveled beyond county lines. He was assigned as an intelligence officer, a role built around maps, reports, prisoner interrogations, and long hours behind the front line. That was what the paperwork said. 4 years of war told a different story. By January 1945, Connor had fought in 10 major campaigns and taken part in 4 amphibious assault landings. He had been wounded 7 times. His chest carried 4 silver stars, each awarded for direct combat action when situations had already gone wrong. Italy in October 1943, Anzio in January 1944, France in September 1944. Each citation followed the same pattern. When units stalled, when leaders went down, when movement forward meant near certain risk, Connor stepped out of roles, meant to keep him safe. 3 weeks before this morning, near the Colmar Pocket, his last wound had put him in a hospital bed. 2 days earlier, he had returned to 3rd Battalion bandages still under his uniform, his body not fully healed. Among the men of the battalion, a reputation followed him quietly. When the situation became desperate, Connor moved forward. He did not give speeches. He did not seek attention. He simply went where the problem was worst. Years of watching battles from both the map table and the frozen ground had shaped one belief he never articulated out loud. Guns, plans, and numbers mattered, but only if someone was willing to stand where none of them belonged. On January 24, 1945, that belief was about to demand more than it ever had before. At 7:15, the German artillery barrage intensified without warning, the impacts marching steadily across 3rd Battalion's forward positions as trees burst apart in sharp white flashes against the snow. For 12 minutes, shells tore through the frozen tree line, shredding branches into spinning splinters and blasting frozen earth high into the air until the noise abruptly stopped. Silence followed. Then came the low, uneven growl of tank engines starting up in the woods. A runner burst into the command post, breath fogging in the cold, as he shouted that German infantry were advancing behind armor, 6 Tigers, moving toward the battalion's left flank. The battalion commander bent over the map, tracing the terrain with a gloved finger, already seeing the problem before anyone said it out loud. If those tanks reached the foxholes, they would roll straight through them. There were no American tanks waiting, no tank destroyers covering the approaches, nothing capable of stopping 6 Tigers head-on. Artillery could do it, but artillery needed eyes. The forward observation post was gone, erased by the opening barrage, its observers killed or wounded. From the command post, the trees blocked every view of the German advance. Connor studied the map in silence. The Germans were coming through a section of woods roughly 400 yards from the command post across open ground swept by artillery. To see them, someone would have to cross that ground alone. Connor reached for a field telephone and a coil of wire. He met the battalion commander's eyes, once, then turned toward the door. Outside, the snow lay unbroken. He stepped into it and began to run. The wire unspooled behind him as his boots punched through the crusted snow, each step sending a sharp jolt up his legs. At first, the German guns were quiet. Connor knew better. At 100 yards, the shells returned. One landed 40 yards to his left, throwing up a geyser of frozen dirt. Another hit 30 yards to his right, the concussion slamming into his chest and knocking the breath from his lungs. They were adjusting. German observers could see him clearly now, a lone figure crossing open ground toward the attack. A shell struck a tree 70 yards ahead, exploding the trunk into a cloud of splinters that hissed through the air. Connor did not slow. Another round landed 20 yards behind him, the blast wave hitting like a fist and nearly pitching him forward. He stumbled, caught himself, and kept running as the wire bounced and snapped across the snow behind him. At 250 yards, a shell destroyed a tree directly in his path, splitting the trunk down the middle and dropping half of it across the ground in front of him. Connor vaulted the fallen tree without breaking stride, hot fragments hissing into the snow around his boots. Another shell landed 15 yards to his left. Frozen dirt rained down, hammering his helmet and shoulders as a high-pitched ringing swallowed every other sound. He reached the American front line at 300 yards, soldiers staring up from their foxholes as he passed an intelligence officer running forward with a telephone toward the enemy. Connor did not stop to explain. 30 yards beyond the foxholes, he dropped into a shallow ditch no more than 18 inches deep, just enough to break his silhouette and give him a clear line of sight into the woods. He yanked the wire once. It held. Connor cranked the handset. The line buzzed, then cleared, and a voice answered from the Artillery Fire Direction Center 3 miles behind the line. 12 American 105mm howitzers were waiting. Connor gave his position. The officer confirmed. Connor raised his head above the ditch. German infantry were moving through the trees 200 yards away, advancing in short rushes, one squad covering, while another moved forward. They were experienced, disciplined, and methodical. Behind them, 4 Tigers pushed through the smaller trees like sapling 60-ton machines, staying under cover as long as they could. Connor lifted the handset and called the first fire mission. The ranging shells arrived 40 seconds later, slamming into the forest 150 yards behind the German infantry. Too far. Connor adjusted. Drop 100. Fire for effect. 18 seconds later, 12 shells detonated in the middle of the advancing formations, the forest erupting as trees disintegrated and men vanished in the explosions. The German advance stopped cold. Connor ordered repeat fire. Then, again, the guns firing at maximum rate as 48 shells per minute hammered the same stretch of ground. Infantry formations shattered. Survivors scattered for cover. But the Tigers kept coming. They emerged from the trees into open ground, advancing in a wedge tank, commanders standing in their turrets scanning for targets. 188mm gun fired, obliterating an American foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right. Another shell followed. The Tigers were 300 yards from the line, minutes from breaking through. Connor shifted his fire onto the tanks. The shells began falling around them, blasts rocking the machines but failing to penetrate the armor. One round hit 10 yards in front of the lead Tiger, and it drove straight through the explosion. Connor needed the fire closer. Drop 50. Fire for effect. The next salvo landed among the tanks. One shell smashed into a track, snapping it and slewing the Tiger sideways, immobilized but still firing. Another took a hit to the engine deck, smoke pouring from the rear. 4 Tigers continued forward. Then they turned toward the ditch. Connor could see them now close enough to make out markings on the turrets and faces in the open hatches. The commanders had spotted the wire. They knew someone was directing the guns. German artillery answered. Shells began landing around the ditch, German observers bracketing Connor's position as American rounds continued to fall in front of him. 2 barrages converged on the same shallow strip of frozen ground. A private crawled forward from the foxholes, dragging extra wire and a spare handset, sliding into the ditch beside Connor without a word. Time stretched. Connor lay in the frozen earth for more than 40 minutes, hands numb, face caked with dirt and ice, adjusting fire again and again as infantry regrouped and tanks advanced in short bursts. The private took shrapnel in the leg and refused to leave. German infantry closed to within 80 yards, then 50, then 30, using craters and smoke for cover, as Connor walked the shells back and forth, creating a wall of explosions between them and the American line. Shells landed 15 yards to his right, then 15 to his left. They had him bracketed. Connor did not move. He kept calling fire. The ditch offered almost nothing now. 18 inches of frozen earth. No overhead cover. No protection from machine guns or an 88mm shell. German infantry were less than 30 yards away, crawling through smoke and craters close enough that Connor could hear officers whispering commands and bolts sliding home on rifles. The Tigers loomed behind them. 2 had already been crippled, black smoke drifting from their hulls, but 3 more kept moving, spreading out 50 yards between each tank, adapting. They were learning. German artillery walked closer, shells landing behind the ditch, then to the sides, qualitative timing, precise and deliberate. Another adjustment, and the next rounds would land directly on Connor's position. There was no safe distance left. Connor checked the map one last time, then looked over the rim of the ditch. One Tiger had closed to about 150 yards, its commander standing in the open hatch, scanning the American line for targets. If the tank reached the foxholes, the battalion would break. If Connor pulled back now, the guns would go blind. He lifted the handset. Fire on my position. The voice on the other end went quiet, then repeated the coordinates slower this time, disbelief clear, even through the static. Connor confirmed. The officer asked again. Connor confirmed a third time. 40 seconds later, the first shells landed 30 yards in front of the ditch. The blast hit like a solid wall, crushing the air out of his lungs and slamming his body into the frozen ground as dirt and fragments tore overhead. The sound was beyond thunder. It was pressure, weight, heat. Connor stayed down, fingers locked around the handset. Drop 20, repeat fire. The next salvo landed closer. Too close. Shrapnel snapped through the air just feet above his head. Hot metal bit into the edge of the ditch. If the shells fell 10 yards nearer, nothing would save him. The Tigers stopped. Their commanders slammed hatches shut, unwilling to advance into explosions landing almost on top of them. But the infantry surged again, using the stalled tanks as cover, closing the distance in short rushes. Connor adjusted again. Left, right, back, forward. Every movement was answered with explosions. German soldiers vanished in flashes of fire and snow. Others went flat-trapped, unable to move without drawing shells onto themselves. Then one Tiger pushed through the smoke, 70 yards from the American line. Its 88-millimeter gun fired, erasing a machine gun position in a single blast. Connor shifted fire directly onto it. Danger close. The artillery officer hesitated. Connor repeated the order. 12 shells arrived together, detonating around the tank-smashing vision ports, jamming the turret ring, rocking the 60-ton machine until it slewed sideways and stopped. The crew bailed out and ran. Rifles cracked from the foxholes. Only one Tiger remained. It advanced alone. Connor called maximum concentration. Every gun. One target. The shells landed. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still there. Armor intact, but blind and motionless, its crew abandoning it under fire. All 6 Tigers were now destroyed or abandoned. The German infantry tried one last push. Connor dropped the shells 5 yards in front of the ditch. The blast lifted him off the ground. Silence followed. Then the ringing began. When it faded, the ground ahead was empty. The attack was over. When the last American shells fell silent, the ground in front of 3rd Battalion no longer resembled a battlefield with clear lines or directions. It looked like the surface of the moon. Shell craters, overlapped shell craters across nearly 200 yards of churned snow, and frozen earth tree trunks snapped and splintered at unnatural angles, branches hanging where forests had stood hours earlier. The 6 Tiger tanks lay scattered across the field in tree lines, some blackened and smoking, others intact, but frozen in place. Tracks, broken turrets, jammed crews gone. Where German infantry formations had advanced in disciplined waves, that morning only scattered bodies, abandoned weapons, and wounded voices remained. American recovery teams would later confirm that all 6 Tigers had been destroyed or abandoned. 4 had been immobilized by artillery damage to tracks and optics. 2 had been left after catastrophic mechanical failure under sustained fire. German losses were harder to measure. 53 German soldiers were found killed where they fell. 78 wounded were left behind during the retreat. Many more had been dragged back into the woods under fire. Conservative estimates placed total German casualties at more than 150 killed and wounded. 3rd Battalion's losses were stark but limited. 11 men had been killed, 23 wounded. Almost all of those casualties had occurred before Connor reached the ditch. After he began directing artillery, the line stopped bleeding. The German counterattack collapsed completely. No follow-up assault came. No renewed probing. The enemy had paid too high a price. For the next 8 days, 3rd Battalion remained on the same frozen ground. The Germans did not attack again. The Colmar pocket would hold a little longer, but its last offensive effort had failed here. Connor stayed in the ditch for nearly 20 minutes after the guns went quiet, watching the tree line, making sure the Germans did not regroup. Only then did he stand. His legs barely held him. 2 hours pressed into frozen earth had locked his joints and numbed his body. He helped the wounded private to his feet and walked him back toward the foxholes step by step. Behind them, the battlefield stayed silent. In the days after the guns went quiet north of the Colmar pocket, the Army moved quickly to recognize what had happened. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of 7th Army, traveled to 3rd Battalion Sector to personally present Garland Merle Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation detailed his advance under fire, 3 hours directing artillery from an exposed position, and his decision to call fire on his own location. The battalion commander had recommended a higher award. But war moves faster than paperwork. Connor had been in combat for 28 consecutive months. He had been wounded 7 times. The Army was rotating him home. By March 15th, he was on a transport ship bound for New York, leaving France behind before the recommendation could move through every layer of command. When the war in Europe ended on May 8th, Connor was already back in Kentucky trying to return to a life that felt smaller and quieter than anything he had known. His hometown held a parade. Another American hero, Alvin York, spoke that day, recognizing something in Connor that only another soldier could fully understand. Connor married Pauline Wells that summer. They farmed. They worked the land. They raised a life that asked nothing from history. The medals went into a cardboard box inside a duffel bag pushed into the back of a closet. Connor never displayed them. He never spoke about January 24th, 1945. When asked, he said only that he had done what needed to be done. More than 50 years passed. In 1996, a letter arrived from a man researching the death of his uncle at Anzio. That letter opened the box. Inside were the citations, the dates, the numbers that told a story Connor had never tried to tell himself. The fight for recognition took decades more. Applications denied, appeals rejected, historians and generals adding their voices, a widow refusing to stop. Connor passed away in 1998, never knowing how the story would end. In 2018, more than 70 years after that frozen morning in France, the Medal of Honor was finally awarded. It was placed into Pauline's hands in the East Room of the White House. It was not a correction of history. It was a reminder of how easily history can overlook quiet people. Connor never asked to be remembered. He never asked for recognition. He simply stayed in place when leaving would have been easier. If you are watching this today, this story is not just about one lieutenant in the snow. It is about the people in your own family who carried heavy days and never spoke about them. Tonight, ask one older person what they remember about the hardest thing they lived through. Listen all the way to the end. If this story mattered to you, hit like so YouTube will show it to someone who has never heard this name. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more true stories of ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and whether someone in your family served. That is how stories like this stay alive.